World leaders continue to react to the missile strike in Poland on Tuesday, in which 2 people died. NATO has confirmed the missile is likely to have been fired by Ukrainian air defence, but the organisation has insisted it wouldn't have happened without Russia's bombardment of Ukraine, and Moscow bears ultimate responsibility. Well, in a moment we'll talk live to the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, but first our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams explains the background.
Yesterday's news of an explosion in Poland caused a shudder of fear throughout the Western alliance, especially in these Eastern European members of NATO, here in red. Was this the moment everyone had been dreading since February, when NATO finally found itself in direct confrontation with Russia? Let's remember what was actually happening yesterday, right on NATO's doorstep. Another day of massive Russian missile strikes, here in red, against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, from one end of the country to the other. Some of those strikes were over the far west, very close to the Polish border, very close to the village where 2 people died. Ukraine said, and still says, that a Russian missile was responsible. Before long, though, experts looked at this wreckage and came up with a different theory, that these were parts of an air defence missile fired by Ukraine. World leaders, from Joe Biden to the Polish president, have all gradually come to the same conclusion. This is the S-300, a Russian-made surface-to-air missile introduced in the 1970s and still widely used throughout the countries of the old Soviet Union, including Ukraine. As Russian cruise missiles flew across Ukrainian cities yesterday, there were frantic efforts to shoot them down. Many were successful, some were not. But Western leaders all agree that Ukraine has an absolute right to defend itself. What happened yesterday in Poland, they say, was not Ukraine's fault.
Paul Adams there. Well, I am joined now by the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. Thank you very much for being with us here on the BBC. You will know that President Zelensky has been speaking within the last hour or so, and there still seems to be some confusion as to what exactly has been found on that border in Poland. And they have said, as we understand it, the Ukrainians have said that they think that their rocket exploded in the air before reaching Polish soil. What evidence do you have about what's happened?
Well, the investigation is still ongoing, but our initial assessment is the same as the Polish assessment, and Poland is actually in charge of the investigation, and that is that most likely this is a Ukrainian air defense missile. But the main message is that Russia bears the ultimate responsibility, because this would not have happened hadn't Russia waged a brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. And yes, there was a wave of missile and airstrikes against Ukrainian cities, and of course Ukraine has the right to defend itself against these attacks. Wars are dangerous and accidents happen, and that doesn't change the responsibility of the aggressive part, Russia, for the consequences of the war.
And it is important to establish the actual detailed facts here, isn't it? And we're hearing that Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky is saying that the investigators should know the serial number of the rocket fired, that there is intelligence, that they would like to be given access to data on what's actually happened. Are you going to share that information with Ukraine?
First of all, the investigation has not been finalized, and therefore no final conclusion is possible to draw from an ongoing investigation. At the same time, I think it is important to be transparent about what our preliminary assessments are, and they are the same as Poland and other allies have reached. Poland is responsible, and Poland is leading the investigation, because this is actually an incident that happened on Polish territory, and I'm sure there is some contact, some dialogue between Poland and Ukraine. But again, the most important thing is to continue to help Ukraine to defend themselves. Today I attended a meeting of the support group for Ukraine, where NATO allies partners made new pledges for more advanced air defense systems, so we can help to shoot down Russian missiles. The best way to prevent any risk for incidents like this in the future is for Russia to stop the war.
OK, but Mr Zelensky yesterday did say initially that it was a Russian missile to blame here. He has said, we think that if it is a Ukrainian rocket, then they would apologise. Is it still possible that this was part of a Russian rocket fired by Russia that's gone into Polish territory, or do you think Mr Zelensky is wrong here?
We have no indications that this is a deliberate attack from Russia, but as I said, we have investigations that are ongoing, and our assessment is so far that most likely this is an air defense missile. I think when it comes to the details, we all have to wait to the investigation has been finalized, but regardless of the outcome of those analyses, there is no doubt, and that is absolutely clear, and all allies agree, and Ukraine agrees, that Russia is responsible, because this would not have happened hadn't Russia launched a barrage of missile attacks against Ukrainian cities yesterday, as they've done many times before during this war.
What is your exit strategy for this war? What does victory look like? Because we've seen a senior UK military voice say that that has not been spelt out, and it should be.
First of all, we have to remember what this is. This is a war of aggression where Russia has invaded another country. We all want peace, and we all also want a peaceful negotiated solution. At the same time, we need to understand that if President Putin and Russia stops fighting, then we will have peace. If President Zelensky and Ukraine stops fighting, then Ukraine will cease to exist as an independent sovereign nation. Therefore, our responsibility is to support Ukraine. At some stage, this war will most likely end at the negotiating table. But we know that the outcome of those negotiations, they are closely and fundamentally linked to the strength on the battlefield. So the more we support Ukraine with military equipment, with military capabilities, the more we maximize the likelihood for a political outcome on the negotiation table, which is acceptable for Ukraine. At the end of the day, it has to be Ukraine that decides.
Is there any channel by which those talks are happening or could happen? Because we saw the top US military general, General Milley, talking about, asking the question about whether it is time for negotiations. Pushback from that, of course, in Kiev, and yet people are asking whether President Zelensky is being unrealistic in his demands for continued support.
So first of all, there has been negotiations before, but that proved that Russia didn't have any real willingness to make compromises. And of course, when they just a few weeks ago annexed parts of Ukraine, that's not an expression of real willingness to compromise and to negotiate. Ukraine has made it clear that they're ready to negotiate, but of course they have clear conditions. Ukraine has the right to defend themselves. They are attacked by another country, and they have the right to defend themselves. That's the right which is enshrined in the UN Charter. And again, we have to support them to enable them to reach a result on the negotiating table, which ensures that Ukraine prevails as an independent sovereign nation.
Are they really, though, understanding that Western support cannot go on indefinitely? I mean, we are seeing huge economic hits to the public, to the taxpayers of Europe and in America. We are seeing food shortages in Africa. We are not seeing total political support around the world. This is very much seen as a European war. Doesn't NATO have to urgently look now for a solution, for a negotiated solution, for a compromise on all sides?
President Putin made two big mistakes when he invaded Ukraine. One was to totally underestimate Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces. The other was to underestimate NATO and NATO allies and partners in our resolve, our unity to support Ukraine. We have provided an unprecedented level of support. We do that because it will be a catastrophe for Ukraine if President Putin wins, but it will also be dangerous for us. Because if President Putin wins, the lesson learned in Moscow, but also in other authoritarian powers, is that when they use brutal force, they will achieve what they want.
So does that mean that Russia has to
more vulnerable and the world more dangerous? Therefore, we cannot allow Putin to win.
Does that mean that Russia has to have no presence in Crimea or the Donbass?
So as I said, at the end of the day, it has to be Ukraine that decides what kind of conditions they're willing to accept. But the likelihood of reaching an acceptable solution on the negotiating table is going up, is increasing the more strength we are able to give them on the battlefield. And that's the reason why we need to support them on the battlefield.
But where do you see the potential lines for agreement?
That's for Ukraine to decide. Ukraine is an independent, sovereign, democratic nation with recognized borders, and if we accept
it is only
that
able
the
to
use
battle.
of
It is only able to fight this war with huge amounts of money and support from European and the American governments.
Yes, you are right that we are paying a price for the support we provide to Ukraine. At the same time, we have to understand that the price we will pay if President Putin wins, it's much higher. Then we will live in a much more dangerous world. We will be much more vulnerable, and we don't know what next will be on his agenda when it comes to using brutal force against neighbors. We pay a price.
That principle doesn't hold everywhere in the world, does it? Because we see that in Syria, after Russian support, President Assad is still there. We see in Afghanistan, after 20 years, the Americans withdrew and the Taliban are back in power. Do you see this conflict going on for that level of time, potentially with Western defeat at the end?
We made a decision on the 24th of February when Russia invaded to support Ukraine, and that is a commitment and that is important in solidarity with Ukraine, but also because it's in our security interests to ensure that Ukraine prevails as an independent sovereign nation. And then at the end of the day, it has to be Ukraine that decides what kind of conditions they're willing to accept. It's our responsibility to help them to achieve an acceptable solution around the negotiating table to end the war.
Let me just also ask you on the specifics of what happened on Tuesday night, because there was a real sense of heightened fear for a short time where people worried that this whole crisis was escalating. Have you put in now extra safeguards or extra channels for talks between, for example, NATO or the US and Moscow, to ensure that there can be no confused or accidental escalation?
There are lines of communications, military lines of communications between the United States and Russia. Actually, the director of the CIA actually met with his counterpart in Ankara just a few days ago, and there are other channels, and also NATO has channels of communications with Russia. We have actually prepared for situations, instances like this for many years in NATO. And we need to ensure that when accident happens, and they happen when there is a war going on in our neighborhood, then we need to ensure that they don't spiral out of control. And that's exactly what we ensured yesterday by reacting in a measured, calm, but also firm way.
Just very briefly, if I may, what do you say to leaders in other parts of the world, outside European territory, in Asia, Africa and elsewhere, who say this war is sucking the political momentum out of other global crises that we should be more focused on?
So this war has global ramifications on the energy prices, on food prices, on the attention we're able to deliver to other important challenges like global warming, climate change. And the best way of preventing that for continuing is for Russia to end the war. Russia started this war, and Russia can end the war because war of aggression is something which is absolutely illegal and should not go on.
OK, Jens Stoltenberg, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.